Hello, everyone. I'm Pinar Givanch, and welcome to What's Wrong with the podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Robert Fabricant. Robert is the co-founder of Dalberg Design, where he brings human-centered design and systems thinking to clients looking for creative approaches to breakthrough innovation and expanded collaborations in social impact and community engagement. He leads an extremely diverse team with studios in Dakar, Mexico City, Mumbai, Nairobi, and New York, leveraging Dalberg's global footprint and capabilities. Much of his portfolio is focused on public health, serving as the lead design partner to USAID's Global Health Bureau. Robert has an MPS in Design and Technology from NYU and writes and speaks extensively about design and social impact. His work is the subject of several Yale Business School case studies, and he has won numerous design awards from Fast Company, Core 77, and Industrial Designers Society of America. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to What's Wrong with the podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of chatting with Robert Fabricant. He's the partner and co-founder of Dalberg Design, which is a social impact design studio. He's an author and a frequent contributor to Fast Company. Robert, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. We've been very much looking forward to this conversation, so I'm super excited. Please tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to where you are at Design today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like many, having listened to a few of the other folks, like Dory Tunstall and others you've had, I think it's been a kind of a circuitous journey. And I don't even know, if I'm standing in one place right now. I wear a few different hats, and I feel like, what I've enjoyed is a lot of opportunities, kind of to sort of shift my perspective on what it is I'm doing. And as part of that, as I've said in other forums, I feel like I've kind of married and broken up with design a number of times over the course of the last 25, 30 years. So it's definitely a journey in chapters. And I feel like I keep finding like this moment of purpose, this sense of, this sort of galvanizing sense of possibility. And then at some point also, feelings of dissatisfaction. And so it's been a little bit of a love-hate relationship. I mean, going back in time, I was always a creative kid, and I think at the time I grew up, the design industry was so niche and specialized. Growing up in New York as a creative kid, I was very lucky that I had the chance to get exposed to a number of different design kind of practices. I worked in book publishing early on in college. I worked for MoMA and the design department there. So I got exposed. I worked at a big corporate branding house, and none of that kind of really fired my synapses in the way I expected. It was a very interesting environment to be in, and I saw the appeal of that, but the work itself did feel kind of rarefied and precious a lot of the time to me. And so coming out of college, I kind of went a very different route. I started working in advocacy and community organizing in the criminal justice system in New York. And it was both interesting and frustrating. Time. This was the time of the sort of crack crisis, huge focus on law and order in the city, huge investment in cops and jails. And I had an interesting opportunity to work across the state, not just in the city, to try and create kind of a different community around criminal justice issues and organizing people across the state to go into courts and observe. It's such a kind of design problem that I didn't see at the time for what it was. But, in the US system, courts are by law open proceedings. So they're meant for anyone to participate and observe, but nobody does. So that feedback loop is broken. And so the design of the proceedings and the way they function is pretty obscure, pretty unexamined. And what was interesting was kind of organizing people to come in and spend time. And that's kind of what I did for those couple of years. I organized people to go into courts and just spend time and issue reports on what they were seeing. And another funny thing I learned is that in many parts of New York State, not so much the city, the lower courts that you interact with, the first kind of level of justice you interact with in a town or village, the person presiding over does not need to be a lawyer. They receive some training, but they do not actually have to have a law degree. It could be your local, the people come from varying backgrounds. It could be someone who's an accountant who runs a local business. Whatever it is, they can sign up and get certified to be a town or village justice. So it's a very much more loosely organized thing than you would imagine. And what was so interesting was figuring out, well, what are the incentives for people to come and show up every day and observe this? What sort of ways are they starting to build and understand what they're seeing so that they feel confident, and then how to work with them to put their voice out there. And where it kind of laddered up to was going then to Albany and talking to politicians who couldn't care less about court reform, and having these little local headlines that said, the judge was late 60% of the time, he used bad language. I mean, a lot of it was like such minor things, but important, when you think about the forum they're in, things you wouldn't be surprised by, given that, most of the issues at hand we're not dealing with high crimes. But anyway, so it was a fun process. And I had a lot of kind of interesting, I think, learnings that I still build off of. But it was a very frustrating environment to work in, resource limited, very hidebound and rule bound. The power structures were very inflexible. And so as a creative person, it also was something that I found, kind of deeply frustrating. There wasn't a lot of space for play, imagination, exploration. And everything I was doing was raising issues, but I didn't have any role to play in really designing what could work, how things could work better. And so I was kind of stuck a little bit. I was interested in people, how they behave. I was interested in sort of changing systems. And, it took me a little while after that to find my way back to design. And I think a growing number of people, but this was a bit earlier in the cycle. This was like the early 90s. I was working as an artist and starting to play with digital tools and digital systems, and really doing it to create things, but getting more and more interested in the fundamental assumptions behind them, how they work, and what are the feedback loops that are shaping the way I interact with someone, and some media or some tools, or with somebody else. And these were very early days of the internet and even CD-ROMs and things. And so it got me into a place where creatively I found what I was doing quite interesting, the problem-solving nature of it, and eventually going to work in side studios with other folks, really talented, fun, creative folks. That part was great, but the problem set wasn't the problem set I was looking for. And particularly, this was when I started doing this work, it was like 93, 94, and by the end of the 90s, right, you had this massive takeover of what seemed like a super interesting intellectual space, creative space, a takeover by the marketing industry. And that's what all that work funneled into was the .com kind of marketing, advertising model. And I would say as a kid, also growing up in New York, I was interested in various creative fields. Actually, it's interesting that the two things I never gravitated towards were architecture, and I know you guys do a bit of that. Space design, I ended up working in an environmental design practice out of grad school, but so physical architecture and also advertising, never interested in it. So I kind of broke up with the whole idea again, until I went over to Frog and was lucky that I found a place where, not just for me, but for a lot of people hired, we were all a little bit refugees from what was so conceptually interesting about the work and all the creative challenges we wanted to work from, but the kind of client and kind of business-led problems that were on the table right then were so marketing oriented, we were trying to find a different place. And Frog, through the early 2000s, was just very special that way. And while a lot of us were coming in with kind of the key that opened the door for a lot of us was kind of interfaces, interaction, a lot of the digital layer. It was just the way to open the door to service design, to user research, to all new interesting forms of kind of system change. And so that was really exciting. And it's still probably kind of one of the places where I think I had the most fun in a way, because it was such a big creative community. A couple hundred designers, and that's a rare thing to be embedded in. It just doesn't exist many places, even today, right? And so that was really fun. And then, something else happened, which is all the things in the early 2000s we were talking about that felt very transformative started to be kind of metabolized by companies. And the way they were coming back also wasn't that as interesting as I'd hoped. There was places where it showed up, and some transformative opportunities for sure. But yeah, it definitely I hit a little bit of that same wall. And particularly, and this is something that I've been meaning to write about, haven't found the right words, when sort of late in that cycle, when a lot of the clients that I started working with in companies were either designers or from design backgrounds. And in a way, you think we've arrived, right? I'm working for, but many of them were just terrible clients. They just didn't know how to create space for other practitioners to bring additional things to the table. They were in their first wave of having some mandate in a company, wanting to kind of control everything, which is 100% understandable. Many still friends, but so that was the next wall I hit, and I started working with some colleagues. One who's my partner at Dalberg, Ravi Chapar, folks like Jan Chipchase and others, to try and extend way outside that corporate footprint. And that was kind of like what brought me to a place like Dalberg, because I realized that one of the things that was holding me back, and I think that still holds the design industry back, is that we're not easy to partner with. We think we are, because in the room, we're very collaborative. We do a lot of wonderful things to bring people to the table and have a very collaborative dynamic. But we're actually not that easy to partner with in the more fundamental way. And so I wanted to go to a place and start to build a practice with Ravi where a lot of the structures were in place for to partner much more deeply with community-based organizations, nonprofits, the public sector, to do it in lots of parts of the world where we had already, through some of the work at Frog, met the most incredible talent, passionate, creative young people with like no idea that there is a actual way that this can become like a professional trajectory for their lives, can have some impact on the issues around them. And so, we wanted to find a place where those conditions were true. And so that's what brought us to this firm and building the practice we have. We just hit 10 years in April. It's kind of awesome. Yeah, so we're about 25, 30 people, and we have little studios in New York, Mexico, Nairobi, and Mumbai. And yeah, the talent's amazing. The projects we work on are amazing. And it's one of the most frustrating and challenging little businesses you could ever invent.
Of course. Well, I mean, that's also the beauty of it. But congratulations on the 10 years. And I love this story because it's also, I feel like when sometimes we speak with like design students, especially, they want to like always understand like, well, how did you come to here though? Like, how did that happen? And there's never like this linear path or like a single route. And it's like all over the place, typically, how you come to where you are. And it has to be that way almost. Like the fact that you had such a love-hate relationship, I think just makes you a better designer because you just zoomed out and like looked at systems, and then you zoomed in to design, and then you zoomed out to like understand problems, and then you zoomed in. And I think why we sometimes see design, and we can talk to we can gossip about the design profession a little bit later, but sometimes we're too much in our own bubble, and sometimes even in our ivory tower, right? And then we don't get out, and then there's a reason why like some of the solutions we're putting out into the world doesn't even resonate or doesn't work, right? So it's so necessary to also have that like almost mini breakups in the relationship. Like as a person, like my background was in engineering and finance, like came into it later. So I loved it, the way, like the approach of it. But at the same time, so many things I didn't understand. Especially like as we started to like get into like co-design, and I'm sure you see this with your work with like nonprofits or CBOs, like why design needs to be the loudest. Why does like co-design like start to raise these like question marks? Like I think that was really eye-opening to me to see. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts in terms of like And you explained it so well, like what made you kind of like hit a wall or like zoom out a little bit or go in a different direction. Um, but also, I think to your earlier point around like we're hard to partner with, and this is also like something that you recently wrote about. There are also some characteristics that we have inherently in the design world. So some of the problems that we're facing in the design industry or working with other industries as designers are kind of self-inflicted in a way. And I would love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it definitely has been fun kind of writing a little bit at this particular moment in time and sharing some views and hearing from people, particularly people of maybe a little more my generation, although, you know, my staff and the folks I work with on our team come from such different cultures and a different generation, which is just unbelievably inspiring. But yeah, I think that one of the diagnoses I have is that even folks that I know who've now had 15 years of, you know, both financial success and some kind of, you know, business or success in terms of the level of seniority of the roles they play. I think at the heart, there is a little bit of a deep-seated inferiority complex that people really like. It's very embedded. I think part of me is probably stating something obvious, but I think creativity often comes out of insecurity. Like I think there's a meaningful tie there in terms of like, what is it that kind of gets you to kind of, you know, want to kind of see things differently and how you see things differently and the ways in which you are kind of questioning and trying to rethink things. I think some of that is tied to that in a productive way, just the way that like stress and pressure are part of the creative process.
Yeah.
Like they're not antithetical. In fact, they're kind of necessary. But I do think that I still think that there is a bit of that kind of around that insecurity and that inferiority complex are some real blind spots about the power we hold or the power we could hold or the way to influence the world, number one, and number two, a desire to both kind of continue to sort of differentiate what we do and make it always sound like something unfamiliar and lean a little too heavily into the jargon, which is something I see actually with as a sort of a very healthy part, but standard part of the process that we have with the talent that we work with and coming from very different backgrounds. Like there's like this sense of like, okay, if I know all the terminology of human-centered design and I know when and how to use it, like I feel a little more credentialed. I feel like people will take me a little more seriously, and there's some truth to it.
Yeah.
But there's a real it really cuts both ways. And I think one of the things that I learned working in doing community organizing and advocacy is kind of the sort of way you can syncopate a little bit how you engage with people and find moments when you are very much avoiding that language and speaking them very directly, hearing from them very directly, speaking from your and their lived experience. Without that, there are moments when elevating it through some of the broader concepts and frameworks that we do use. It's just it's sort of like a rhythm, and it's, you know, I think different people do it differently. But when I'm working with a younger designer and we're in a room, let's say a lot of the work we do in the public sector and the social sector is very technical. It's public health. You know, it's like, you know, people are just our clients and partners, whether they're nonprofits or governments, are deeply policy wonky people. And so you have to know how to speak to their language. But if we're in a conversation, we're talking about, you know, work we did in the community and the voices of the community, and someone's only filtering through that language, like I'll talk to them after and say, you've got to vary it. Then give a very like deep human truth and a very accessible story, and then figure out how you bring it back to the models of the frameworks, the theories of change. But it's kind of I think that is a really important skill to have as a designer, and it takes some humility and self-awareness to do it. For me, I draw back on some of my work in community organizing, but we're actually coming back to the project we were just talking about in Houston. We're embedding community organizers with our team. And it's always interesting to hear like what elements of our work and the participatory design process do they start to adopt? Because it's additive to the way they, as deeply empathetic, deeply collaborative people, what is something that feels like it's really meaningful to them? And those become the things that we kind of internalize in the approach to the project, for example. And then how do we work with some of the partners and clients, and in this case, the funder, to walk them on a journey from thinking of what we do as, either, market research, focus groups, like that kind of language, to sort of walk them on a journey to they see that there's a lot more depth and nuance, and the way we can structure the power dynamics of the collaborations we do is just a bit different. And then, so, it's definitely a thing that I've always, I think I have a source to draw from to catch myself a little bit. And particularly as I go across different cultures, it's taken me a while. I think when Ravi and I started this practice, I think to be oversimplified, I think we thought that, the blueprint was there, human-centered design, IDEO frog. We've just got to open that door for a lot more talent to adopt those practices. And instead, I would say it's really the second half of our tenure, the last 5 years, where we've really started to recognize that the practice that we're creating and that our team wants isn't a blueprint of them. And there are a lot of other ingredients that come from their backgrounds of lived experience, many not having been through design programs and training, and also the communities we work with and community partners that they admire, and that's another funny disconnect for me, is that I have all these folks working for me who admire these folks in community-based organizations and community partners who are committed to human rights and social justice and all this stuff, but they haven't actually ever sat in those shoes. And I did a little bit, and it is very different. It's very different to commit yourself to being embedded in communities as someone who works on social justice day in, day out, versus a designer who's trying to contribute and strengthen it, but you still want to sit in that design space. And it's not a criticism, it is very different. And so having folks like that side by side on our team is really interesting, to sort of see kind of the different view and incentives that motivate people, the different ways that people are committed to the work, the different ways that people read, in particular, like the social and power dynamics and histories around them. And that's one of the more interesting spaces of learning that I think we've created in our funny practice. That's been really exciting for me.
Yeah, I mean, that's beautiful, because I feel like you kind of start reaching that awareness and being able to take action on it if you're actually like a little bit smaller team. Like, I feel like in a corporate setting, when we talk about working together inclusively or having a diverse environment, we're still in a corporate setting stuck a little bit in like representation, like HR level, like, oh, we're aiming for diversity, but diversity doesn't mean inclusion, or how that inclusion kind of reflects into the work that we do. So it's beautiful to observe that. And I think it's also going back to what you said around humility, like knowing that the learning never ends, right? Like you can never be done with it too. And unless you like really live that in your environment and practice that in your projects, I feel like it is hard to also adopt that attitude over time. And what you said in terms of like going back to the language and the jargon and knowing when to use it, almost like a tool, right? I love that, because I feel like, being a designer sometimes is such a strong identity, maybe towards like our detriment, in the sense that like, okay, this is the language I use and this is how I talk, and because I'm a designer. But at the same time, because you're a designer and you're there to also solve problems, like what tactics or tools are you utilizing? And being able to kind of change levels or even like the ways of communication is such a thing that, like, such a important thing that I think doesn't, it's almost like I feel like there should be a whole class on it. You know what I mean? Even like design school, like it is not like a nice to have, or it's not like dumbing down the language or the profession. Is actually necessary if you want to be, especially in your space, like in social impact, right? Like if you're going to work with people from all walks of life, you should be able to know how to communicate. and I think, you know, being a parent is a great exercise for that. Like when you try to like communicate something to a 5 or 6-year-old is very eye-opening. But I think that we kind of either overlook or undermine that a little bit in the design space. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts, because I feel like as an external, like third party, smaller studio consultant, it's quite evident to us when if we cannot do that well, right? Like either the project doesn't go well or you lose the client. Like it's very sheer response that you could get by not kind of like being tactical or strategic. Even like maybe strategy is an overused term at this point, but like really there is such thing as strategic design. How do you see it reflects or impacts in a corporate setting, right? Like I feel like, and you wrote about this a little bit too, design is playing a little bit defense these days in like bigger corporate environment. And what has been some of the costs or symptoms that we're seeing in corporate setting to not effectively work with, you know, diverse people, being like focusing on community, not community only, but like communication. What has been the like the results of that or outcomes of that in much larger settings or much bigger organizations or systems?
Yeah, it's a great question. And maybe to offer just one more reflection before I look at that bigger space, particularly the corporate space and some of the things that I've written about that might be going on there. I do think that designers work best and are most creative when they have a certain amount of sort of emotional security, you know? And some of that's like the basics of just like the paycheck and the environment they're in and stuff. And so one of the things I do try and do very actively in the work I'm doing and communicate with my team about is I see my role specifically as someone with a certain kind of tenure and voice that I can bring to bear is how do I create the right conditions for that dialogue to happen between my team and the client. And in both cases, I kind of have to work with and bring along. And it's a tough thing to carry because on the one hand, the client is a client, and they're not just a client because they're writing a check with us. The client is the government. It's, you know, it's people who have a role and a mandate in a community and in a system. And so how do you bring them along so that they're receptive to the kind of language that's going to make our team feel secure? You know, we've come into a space in a lot of social impact work we do where, unlike the corporate space, like even some of the basic language of kind of design, user experience, any of it, it's just not going to be what you're hearing back. And it can create a sense of anxiety and fuel that sense of inferiority. No one's using this language, so I'm going to only use this language, kind of thing. And so it is a real there's a mentorship role to it in our advisor model within our practice. And I constantly get asked these questions because I'm not great at like always stepping back and coaching people, but in the moment I can read that and rebalance it. And so afterwards, I'm always kind of talking to people like, why did that moment need to be a little rebalanced? Why did we need to back off from certain language and such? So anyway, I definitely lived that. And it's definitely like, as I think about my tenure, now that this practice has a lot more diverse leadership, like what do I continue to be able to do for people? You know, that's definitely one of the things I hear back from the team quite a bit. I think when it comes to kind of the bigger world, I mean, we operate in some very big institutions like the UN and others, but Gates Foundation, whoever. But when you think about the world of business, which I also have been writing a little bit about, and it's mostly based on reflections I'm hearing from the people and peers I know who've been going through often, you know, a somewhat kind of tough cycle where some of the ways in which certain aspects of design, and coming back to language, have been metabolized in companies, didn't necessarily translate into the level of commitment and mandate that they thought it had. And some of that, I think, is just a kind of multi-generational problem for design, you know, which kind of needs to kind of reestablish a little bit like the networks that we have across companies and within companies and what purpose they serve us. Some of it has to do, I think, with this question of power, and both, I think many folks had the opportunity to institutionalize more of the power they held and they realized, but didn't know how to do it. Many also took titles and salaries assigned for certain kinds of power that they actually didn't have. So I think that there's this question of power and advocacy that I feel like are maybe coming to a head a little bit right now. And the positive conversations, the ones that are inspiring me right now, particularly from folks in business and tech, do have to do with advocacy. Like what role do we want to play in either changing organizations from within or advocating from the outside for changing views and changing principles to be applied to big, now technologically augmented systems of health and finance and knowledge and whatever the hell else. And so I do think that there's a missing piece. And again, some of it is that I think we, in our collaboration style, we don't lean into power. We try and diffuse it. I think that's great. And actually, the people I know who are community organizers and such they work with, like, that's the part they love.
Yeah.
But at the same time, by doing that, we've come to, I think, as a community and particularly leadership, to be uncomfortable with anyone pointing to us and saying that you have power. And in some ways, it's because even as you rise hierarchically in these organizations, you're still the only creative person in a C-suite, and no one's listening to you that much. Like you don't own the budget, you don't own the this and the that. And so it's hard sometimes to even feel like you feel, I think, in this precarious position a lot. And that's what I've heard. And this down cycle of the buildup has reinforced that sense of being in a precarious position. The next job, either not being there or feeling very tenuous. And that, again, fuels a discomfort with an inability to see some of the power you could hold and use, in the world. And so either support younger and mentor younger designers, more diverse designers, to try and influence agendas around the role of technology in our lives, and to some degree, have a voice that we didn't have in the rise of social media and other things. So it's just a funny moment. And at the heart of it, I still think there is some of that inferiority that's coming back for a lot of people. And I think that's not going to help us, I think, rethink kind of what the purpose we have individually and collectively as a design community, design leadership community, and kind of lean in and have the impact we could. And so, I think that that's the dynamic I see in here quite a bit from people. And what's interesting is trying to take those people and partner them with people from policy, from advocacy, because I do think that there's actually a real bridge to build there.
Yeah. And I think, sometimes, especially if we're in the field, it feels like the end of, like, the demise. But at the same time, like, even when we look at our own personal journeys, nothing is linear, right? Like, to your point, like, there was like a bigger design conversation being like adopted in corporations, but at the same time, that doesn't mean it was digested, right? Like, in a way, what we're seeing, what's happening with DEI even today, like, you first need the cultural shift to happen for a DEI leader to make sense or be able to do anything. Because I like similar conversations I have with some like C-suite DEI people or like DEI leaders, is that either nobody was listening to me or I didn't have a budget, right? Like, so, but then what does that tell in terms of like the environment that they're in now? Like, is it even ready for that like singular position? Or to your point, should we look into way more diffusing this for a leader to then make sense, right? And I think like, and like, going back to there will always be like finger pointing, maybe like budget, whoever's holding the budget will have the power in some ways, especially in a capitalist environment. But then going back to what we were saying earlier in terms of like, what is the communication there to be able to talk to the budget people, to be able to talk to like everybody, and like kind of getting out of our own design bubble, which you have to, because you're not in the system that you're in is quite diverse, like discipline wise. And then like recognize those layers of diverse disciplines, diverse cultures, diverse backgrounds, diverse like regions you need to work with. And what does that even mean? And I think that's a whole other set of skills and tools that is even maybe not necessarily like traditionally embedded into design, but then going back to then how do we change design education or training around design leadership, which is now what we're seeing also with like technologists, right? Like how do we change how we educate around technology so we actually develop technology more responsibly and not having to like red team the 500 things that go out into the world in one day. I want to ask your thoughts on, especially when it comes to like design and social impact. And as an educator, I of course see this, like there is this like tremendous drive and motivation for social impact, especially in the younger generation designers, which like whenever I'm frustrated with like the status quo, it always just makes me happy. Like, okay, future looks bright because there's like a massive group of like young people who just want to add more value, which is not necessarily just like monetary value. But I also see the impatience that is coupled with that, which is not helping, right? Like to your point, and seeing systems like the criminal justice system and working with governments, like the bigger the institution you're working with, the higher the impact you'll have. But at the same time, that also means things will move way slower. So how do you help young designers or next generation design leaders to also build and recognize and celebrate almost like micro movements, like micro wins? How do you introduce that into it? How do you kind of almost like break down social impact to the point where you feel like going back to, you know, hitting walls and sometimes feeling like you're not doing anything, or, and this is especially what I see in designers who like just graduate and go into job. And when I have like catch up with them, typically when I see is like, if they're in the bigger corporate, they're frustrated. They feel like a token hire. They don't feel like they have impact within the organization. And it kind of like over time, it's also demotivating and even pushing people out of the design world because they feel like they're not going to have much impact. So how do you introduce this like gradual buildup of progress into this design language, and also motivation, having worked with like many young designers and working with them from like diverse disciplines and settings?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. And coming back to one of the statements you just made, like I've broken up with design a bunch of times. So people leaving and coming back to me is a very healthy dynamic. You know, I've
Yeah.
had several folks leave our practice and go get MPHs, Masters of Public Health degrees,
Yeah.
you know, and I think that's huge. And part of what is the engine for the work we do at Dalberg is to have a very healthy process where people that we're hiring, many come out of social enterprises and NGOs, and many will go back into either existing ones or build new ones. And part of our job, I feel like as a leadership team, is to embed them with some durable design practices that they can bring into that work. They don't need to call themselves a designer, it doesn't matter, but having some durable design practices they bring into that work. And so I feel like that's kind of a pretty important part of our model and legacy, and something we're very committed to. Back to your question, I have a couple observations, because, you know, on one level, everybody that works in our practice seems young to me. I'm in my late 50s. It's just like everybody seems young. So I try and keep that in mind, that they're actually people are in very different places. I do feel like I struggle sometimes with folks who are just out of graduate school
Mm-hmm.
and are excited about the idea of doing social impact work and put it on a certain kind of pedestal in terms of how it aligns with their values, which, coming back to your point, is a wonderful thing. And I think more universal in design education now than it used to be, where it used to be Nike or somebody else. But at the same time, I think there are some practical elements that sometimes go a little, that aren't that are a little, people are a little less aware of. One is that the work that we do in communities takes emotional maturity. I'm not saying that I was emotionally mature in my 20s. I'm not even saying I could have done this work in my 40s, but I'm doing it now, and it just does. And so just because you've learned about it and did an interesting class, did a partnership with a local nonprofit, and it was the most meaningful thing you did in grad school or in undergrad, doesn't mean that you're ready to navigate those situations. Those situations don't always leave you as the designer feeling like you've just had a warm hug. I mean, there are emotionally draining situations, and the logistics, the navigation around them, everything can be quite demanding. And so we go through that cycle for the people on our team. And it's not about age. We have people with incredible lived experience in their 20s who come from such interesting, diverse background. And so it's not purely about age, but it is, I think, a fact of life. And it's something that particularly community-based people, if you're coming from the outside to work and engage, and when I say the outside, I say it respectfully. We have a team in India, in Mumbai. If they decide to go work in Bihar, like it's a very different place, right? So people pick up on that, and want to feel some sense of that maturity. So I think that's a piece that I do think doing this kind of work builds it pretty quickly, but it's a piece that some people struggle with. And in my mentorship role, and particularly Aika Matemu, who runs our Africa practice, like she's so emotionally wise, and I turn to her, and a lot of us do at times, because that's a tough journey to go on. And it even in an environment that feels like it's grounded in the right values, nonetheless, it's, like I said, it's not always affirming of your personal identity at every step of the way, right? So that's one thing that I think is true. And then the other thing we're thinking, and maybe this is an end run back to something I didn't quite answer, a lot of the things that need to change, both in companies and institutions, aren't the sexy things, right? And I feel this in our own practice. We were writing our statutes. I was just going over our data capture policies. Like, there's a whole bunch of things that you need to get. You can't ever get them 100% right, but you need to start to move on in order to both do this kind of social impact work, but I think also to institutionalize some of the core values and mindsets that I think designers aspire to. And those kind of partnerships, it's not just, the business owner, the GM of the sort of business line you're working on. It's going to be people in finance and risk management, and, people in HR who you need different hiring practices that don't just map to, some of where there is a loud voice around DEI and other issues. They just map to the fact that, professional credentials, academic credentials don't mean as much in design as they do in other fields, right? Someone went to a certain business school, you assume certain things. With design, so there are just different differences in teaming practices, differences in hiring practices. So there is just a lot of plumbing to it all. And, when we talk to our clients a year or two after a project, sometimes we're excited because whatever the programmatic collaboration and solution we worked on is out there and starting to reach people. But sometimes they'll tell us, the most amazing thing happened. Like, my HR person allowed me to hire for a role that I never could have hired for before. And that's like a really important beachhead. Or I was able to get funding for something that I don't yet have the evidence base for, but it's going to be more of an iterative kind of project. And I was able to figure out the funding on that. So those things, there is a big asymmetry there, because those aren't the things that designers came out of graduate school, who want to do social impact work, all excited about. Yet very often those are the things where, you can start to measure some, impact. And that's true. That's true. It's as true, if not even more true, in large public sector organizations, because you don't have the luxury of a business owner with a P&L with a lot of autonomy. It's like everybody is trying to work together and manage risk in a very kind of consensus kind of driven way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. I remember talking to one of the senior people at a giant creative ad agency, and I was telling them, you guys need to make process sexier. It's always this final glory shot. The ad industry did that too, right? We need that photo. And I see this in architecture too. When buildings are done, the photos taken in buildings, there are no people in them. I'm like, well, but it's a space for the people.
And then they come back 5 years later when the people have placed a plant in the corner because it was so severe, and they're like, all right, we're going to photograph it, let's remove the plant. It's like, no, this is a lived experience.
Exactly. There's this thing about no, before they mess up the space. I'm like, well, you didn't build a sculpture though,
right.
It's
something.
So it's very...
Do you think the architecture field is making progress?
I mean, I feel like so there's definitely more hints of participatory practices,
Yeah.
but I feel like they're in well, also they're like bigger architectural firms, I think, are noticing that community engagement is actually part of RFPs now from bigger
Yeah.
institutions like government. So that is pushing them to team up with like smaller companies or nonprofits to be able to do that because they haven't built that muscle, I feel like, over the
Hmm.
years.
Yeah.
And I feel like some smaller studios are like us, like are trying to practice co-design within architecture. And
Hmm.
it's really hard. Like, and what you're realizing also is, oh, like sometimes you just do it without having to try to convince the client about it. If they're bringing you on, it's just part of your
Yeah. It's the
process.
way you
You
work.
don't try to educate around it. You
Yeah.
just run it and do it. Like, and
Yeah.
whether they understand the value or not later is up to them, but you do it anyway. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like, I think we're not, the field is not even in a space where, because it works with built environment, real estate,
Yeah.
like it's almost like educating the client is secondary. You just need to like embed it into your own practice in ways like
Hmm.
find these like micro interventions
Yeah.
like throughout the process so you can do it without changing. And the pressure is without changing the timeline and budget, right? So how
Yeah.
do you practice this to the point that you know what it's going to take on your side because you can't go to the client about it. So it's
Yeah.
almost like
Hmm.
we're a little bit like orphans in it, like that there's no
Yeah.
parents to like support you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I feel like real estate, there's a saying like if the car industry was like the real estate industry, we would still be riding horse carriages. Like there's a general lag, I feel like, in built environment. Whatever's happened, like I think digital is fastest. And then you see
Hmm.
more in like product. I already hear it from like our students or like young team members who have
Hmm.
studied industrial design. Like there is like user experience is a conversation, but in architecture, there's no class around it. So there's a lot to say about
Yeah.
architectural education. So
Yeah.
even though it is a creative field, I feel like it's treated as a bit more like technical field at the moment. And whatever creativity meant, it meant architecture for a while. So we're trying to get out of
Hmm.
that architecture world. So I think in that sense, a lot of
Hmm.
the things you're saying really resonates. And some of the things you're
Hmm.
saying, like focusing on the process or the real innovation is really doing these like interventions that get in the way of things it is that it's quite chronic, right? It's not even industry
Yeah.
specific at times. It's typically
Yeah.
just happening because we're working in a big system. So there's these like system problems we need to address regardless of
Yeah.
the industry. But I love what you said in terms of emotional maturity as well.
Hmm.
And to your point, like there are 20-year-olds more mature than 6-year-olds at times, but
Yeah.
being able to have that and having like that bring the patience you almost
Yeah.
need in this field. I think, I don't
Yeah.
know if it was the CEO of NVIDIA, he said this, but we can fact check this later. But there is this quote, um, quick wins, quick, like fast success builds ego, slow success builds character, or something like that.
Mhm.
But I love that, I feel like
Mhm.
we try to reach like the thing that's going to change the world like so fast, but in the end, it doesn't, and then we just get discouraged. Meanwhile, like if we recognize these like going back to some of the qualitative feedback, right? Like seeing those as wins and seeing that is going to drive progress, and those micro interventions you're doing in a big system is actually going to have a bigger impact. I
Yeah.
think that's very valuable for next generation designers to hear or like design leaders really to be able to see how do we measure that, how do we assess that, how do I communicate that to my team so we feel more empowered. um, so with that, and I want to be mindful of our time because clearly I can talk about this all day, what would be your advice to anyone who wants to make or like push for progress in their field and you know working with either small or big teams really and in different fields, but they're interested in making some impact? What would be your advice to them?
Yeah, I mean, in our work, we found that it's very important that we take a humble and open look at the ecosystem and the stakeholders within it. And around that, look for where there are some of those, I'm not sure I would call them micro interventions, but some places where you can really shift the way someone is working and thinking about kind of their own incentives, the community or the problem they're working on, and be very open to kind of where those points are. And then bring that full set of kind of empathetic and user-centered approaches to that person and their role and their decision-making process. Very few things that we work on is the end result going to be delivered by one person making one decision. It's a heavily coordinated and in most cases fragmented and disconnected kind of set of conditions and people. And so I do think it's really important to be in service of that and not just in service of the outcome that matters to you, which is a better food system or a more sustainable, the design of a more sustainable, little solar plant in a village or whatever, or access to, lower cost healthcare. Like those are the things that you need that big thing to kind of get you kind of oriented in the right direction. But yeah, I think it's being very open-minded about who those folks are, finding ways to connect with them, and as part of connecting with them, sharing your own questions about what you're trying to achieve and what's possible, accepting that some of the constraints they're operating under are real, not just, things a designer you get to ignore, so they should ignore too, particularly as a design consultant, maybe you do get to ignore a lot of that stuff in your day-to-day. And so I think that there's a really healthy practice there. And we have some folks, I was just talking this morning to one of my advisees who worked on a behavioral science team within the government in India. And, on some of the projects that she's on, it's just amazing because you can see that immediate kind of both maturity and ability to engage, and you don't have to take all your creative tools and creative identity and put it to the side. But yeah, I think that there is an ability to read those dynamics that I think is such an asset. And I do believe that as a designer, like you bring something unique as a set of tools and how you do that, but it's always in service of.
Yeah, I love the recognizing being in service of. I think what an actionable advice. I was thinking, like, yes, it's an open-minded attitude, but doing that ecosystem mapping almost forces you to decentralize and recognize that there's so many players that you're going to have to work with. So like that power sharing is almost like the first step of it, right? And recognizing, also realizing and putting yourself in check, like who are you in the service of? And then this sharing the questions almost and forces you to have a listening session too. So you kind of like listen without, putting away your own assumptions. And then I think the next step there is like recognize the real constraints, like not what you want to do, but like what actually is meaningful to people. So what a great like actionable steps for young people. I wish like somebody told me when I was in college, like just build an ecosystem map no matter what you're like working on. I think that's an incredible step to just start anything. But Robert, this was such a treat. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for what all that you're doing in the design and social impact space. The more and more, as an educator and I see like next generation designers, the more I understand the value of studios and firms who are really doing meaningful work to really motivate and encourage the next generation too. So thank you. I know it's not easy, but thank you for doing the hard work.
That's so sweet of you. And I had the pleasure of listening to a number of the conversations you've had, and you've had such an interesting, diverse group of people that you've been in dialogue with over the course of this podcast. And I know it's a lot of extra work in addition to teaching and running a business. So yeah, thank you for that. And for across all that, the efforts you're making to make sure it's a very diverse set of voices.
Thank you. And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.